sarcastically with emptiness as a virtue, a practice that is practiced simply to be practiced over and over with no thought to those pests called ethics or responsibility. It is no accident that these were the views that were to be consecrated within the cultural nationalist ethos of American empire at the height of the Cold War, creating an individualistic schema whereby a happy binary could be drawn between something called an ideology and something else called art. A schema whose legacy endures to this day in mainstream common sense perceptions of artistic integrity and pursuit, even as it is challenged, as it was challenged and continues to be by revolutionary aesthetic schools, including the historical precursors of the Black arts movement. Not so for the subject resisting colonization, and not so for Kennefani. According to Kennefani's sister Faiz, merely a day before the martyrdom of Kennefani and his niece Lamis had asked him to temper his political activities and focus exclusively on his writing, a proposition to which Kennefani responded, "Go back to writing stories. I write well because I believe in a cause, in principles. The day I leave these principles, my stories will become empty. If I were to leave behind my principles, you yourself would not respect me." Connection. The connection between the political and the beautiful, between the revolutionary and the imaginative, and between one another. For Kennefani did not write fragmented stories about individual Palestinians. He wrote and rewrote the story of Palestine. He helped give shape and coherence to the tragedy and integrity of the Palestinian struggle in each of its phases. There is, Kennefani taught us, no single Palestinian story, for even the most seemingly isolated moments of dispossession and rupture may evoke a collective resonance. Ours is and always will be a shared struggle leading inevitably toward liberation true and full. And Kennefani understood that to do this work was an act of resistance. It is indeed from Kennefani's own writing and phrase-making that literary critic Barbara Harlow would adopt the concept of resistance literature, an entry point to accessing the literary works produced through and within militant anti-colonial movements fighting for liberation across the globe. Resistance literature, unlike the evacuated aesthetic curiosities that appeals to the universal sensibility, insists upon its specificity, its geography, its politics. In that sense, the writer of resistance literature flatly rejects the universal as an erroneous distortion, or perhaps as Kennefani, a brilliant dialectician, might have put it, the writer of resistance literature understands that the concept of the universal remains a false illusion so long as it is used to distract from the need to immerse oneself in the particular demands of struggle, which is the necessary prerequisite for accessing anything that might be said to approximate a universal status. So I think, obviously there's a lot more to say, but on that note, it's good to shift gears and I think finally begin our panel discussion, with our esteemed panelists. So now I have a few questions I'd like to begin asking. Excuse me. The first is as follows. Ghassan Kanafani is often famously quoted as saying, "My political position springs from my being a novelist. Insofar as I am concerned, politics in the novel are an indivisible case, and I can categorically state that I became politically committed because I am a novelist, not the opposite." But what does this really mean? How are politics and the novel actually connected? How could being a novelist, and perhaps we can even extrapolate to saying a poet, short story writer, any kind of creative artist, make one politically connected? How do each of you interpret Kennefani's words here as a scholar and as a playwright, respectively?
Why didn't you go for it?
Okay, thank you. First, I just want to thank all the organizers for putting this together and the invitation. It is a huge honor to be here and to be in conversation on Ghassan Kanafani. First, let me begin by speaking directly to the quote, Omar, that you gestured to, and then I want to segue to point to perhaps his philosophical thinking about the role of art and politics, which was influenced by the politics of that historical moment from which he wrote in. So in that quote where he says, "My political position springs from my being a novelist, that I became politically committed because I am a novelist and not the opposite," in some degree, he actually quite literally meant that, but it also meant much more. So what I mean by this is, as you said in your introduction, Kennefani was a stateless refugee. He lived in several countries after the Nakba, one of those countries being Syria. And in Damascus, he went to high school. He got his teacher certificate and taught in the UNRWA refugee camps. And it was his reflections of what he was witnessing in the camps that transpired into his writing and his interest in Arabic literature, which was what he began studying at Damascus University in 1952. And he was actually very curious in actually understanding Zionist literature, even before really understanding Palestinian cultural production. And so a year after this, he meets George Habash in Syria. And Habash introduces Kanafani to politics in a really radical sense, and then went on to really influence Kanafani's early works. Now, when we think about this period historically, there was so much going on of political significance about how politics and the novel are connected, and that tells us and speaks to that. When Kanafani was studying at the university in Damascus, there was also a burgeoning movement among Arab writers in the Arab world that advocated for literary commitment. And in Arabic, this translates to the word iltizam, which was inspired by principles of socialism and French existentialism. And there were many debates about the committed role of the writer in the fight against colonialism, the role of the writer in the struggle for liberation, democratization and modernization of the nation state, which was heavily debated and discussed in the literary journal Al-Adab, which was founded in Beirut in the 50s by Suhail Idris. And this paved the way for the tenets of committed literature, which was to be responsible, devoted to social problems, and declare political positions in writing. So it really tried to carve out sort of a politics for writers and cultural producers. And this literary commitment became increasingly militant among writers, especially against Zionism in tone, especially after the 67 Naksa. But two things happen in parallel. On the one hand, in the 70s, you also see a decline of committed literature broadly in the Arab world, but because of the defeat of 67, but for Palestinians, it becomes quite the contrary because of the Zionist occupation inside. And so for Palestinians, there was no debate about the role of iltizam. You know, and Kanafani tells us that the question of commitment was not a subject of debate among Palestinian intellectuals, especially those that were living inside and under occupation. And for them, it organically evolved. So it's not coincidental that in 1968, Ghassan Kanafani publishes his seminal text, Resistance Literature in Occupied Palestine, which first describes the literature and poetry of protest written under cultural siege by Palestinians themselves. And so Kanafani brings to, light the works of Mahmoud Darwish, Sami al-Qasim, Tawfiq Ziad. And this took the Arab world by storm because a lot of the Palestinians that remained inside 48 were seen as traitors for staying inside during this period. And so Kanafani, as he started to sort of theorize that work as resistance literature, for him, he believed that the production of literature or cultural production more broadly should be directly involved in the struggle against, power and domination, particularly against Israeli settler colonialism and hegemony that, was practiced, but also broadly around world revolution, whether it was because of anti-imperialist sort of commitments and other sort of structural inequalities. Remember, this is also the time of the rise of the PLO, which not only waged the armed struggle, but it had an intricate and very elaborate network of cultural organizations and institutions that were also producing culture. And so cultural work in this period really embodied the principles of commitment, because for revolutionary culture producers of that time, the struggle in the sphere of culture was crucial in order to recapture an everyday Palestinian national identity threatened by the ethnic cleansing, but also a medium to raise awareness about the struggle, mobilize people, shape a new generation's consciousness, but also to express solidarity with other political struggles across the world, especially during the era of third world decolonization. And Kanafani was at the center of all of this work, which I don't have the time to get into. So, through his interest in literature, this literally brings him to politics in a way through this encounter with Habash at the university. And his radicalization in a political sense, made for him politics and the novel as indivisible. And in fact, the day, as you mentioned, before Lamis, before he was assassinated in 1972 in a conversation with his niece Lamise. He tells her that I write well because I believe in a cause and in principles. And the day that I leave these principles, you yourself would not respect me. And so part of convincing his niece that his work as a novelist wouldn't be possible if he wasn't using culture as a site of struggle and fought with the pen. And I think that he wasn't only assassinated because of, because of his role as a spokesperson of the PFLP. I also think that he was assassinated because of the powerful role he played as a writer in the way that he was not only generating a very specific kind of revolutionary consciousness, but what that meant in terms of mobilizing cadres for the ranks of the revolution at the time. So I want to stop there, but I think for me, the historical moment of when he was writing, there was so much happening. And I think that that moment tells us that you couldn't actually divide culture from politics, politics from cultural production or vice versa. But I think it offered there was a lot of debate in thinking about this role. And I think for him, it was clear that there was no division and that culture was a site of struggle.
Thank you, Chadni. That was brilliant. And thank you all much for your really thoughtful introduction. It's an honor to be on this part of this conversation and to kind of just chat with you guys, and thank you to the Palestinian Youth Movement for organizing this and for all that you do, and for the Kanafani Scholarship, for which I've been a judge in the past, and which I think is a great program and very necessary. I'm speaking to you all from Chile, from Mapuche and Boenche land, and also going into the second year of a popular revolt against the neoliberal regime here in Chile. So I just want to give that shout out as well. I think I'm not a scholar in the way as Omar and Chadni are. And so I speak to you as a playwright, as a Palestinian diaspora, and as someone who is engaged with Kanafani's work, adapting it for the stage. My kind of initial reaction to that quote that you read to us, Omar, is that, of course, obviously everything is political. The personal is political. And as you pointed out, I mean, much of the kind of art for art's sake, which claims not to be political, its silence or its in its kind of apolitical, supposedly apolitical stance, is in itself also a political act, of course. I mean, to ignore the political is a political act. So, for me to tell any human story is to be political. The personal is political. And I mean, that's a timeless universal truth. And even though in every generation and every era, it's, there's an attempt to kind of bury that, right? It kind of always seeps through. And I mean, even at this moment, right, could it be any clearer that the personal is political? I mean, even our breath is a political act, right? I mean, who you transmit a virus to, or your privilege and feeling you are not susceptible to a virus because of your age, because of your class, because of your race or ethnicity or geographic location, and the decisions you then make. I mean, that even our breath literally is political. So, I think also part of our kind of decolonization process is about kind of crushing colonizing mythologies, one of which is that the personal is not political and that you have the option of not being political, of kind of isolating yourself, And so I think one of the tasks of any kind of cultural resistance and decolonization is about kind of dispelling the spells and mantras of capitalism, which tell us that you can and should isolate yourself you should get yours, embrace individualism and profit and privatization, do away with the commons, with solidarity, empathy, and any kind of collective imagination of the future. And of course, it's a lie, because we're all interconnected with our environment, with other human beings, and that in itself is political. And so, kind of my reaction is that truly write human stories is to engage with a larger story, which is of course political. And I just wanted to read really quickly something that came to me today from the poet Jericho Brown, in which he says, which they say, every poem is a love poem. Every poem is a political poem. So say the masters. Every love poem is political. Every political poem must fall in love. The political poem has an aim, whether the poet is aware of it or not. When I say I love you, I mean for you to understand that I exist in relation to you and your view of me. Every poem challenges or supports the status quo, so say the masters. Poets whose work supports the status quo often fail to acknowledge that their poems are just as political as poets whose work questions it. So I think that arrived to me today for a reason, and it felt that it kind of went nicely with that quote that you read from Kanafani.
Well, thank you both for some very brilliant answers, and Ismail for sharing that moment of kind of artistic synchronicity. I think it's really very relevant. And both of what you said, I think, set us up pretty well for the next question. So it seems generally we're pretty much, in agreement, I think, about the ideas of the possibility of separating the artistic from the political, right? But I think what's also kind of interesting about Kanafani is also that even with a figure like him who made the case so indisputably, right, the lines maybe aren't always as clear cut as they may seem. So on the one hand, Kanafani was accused by younger Palestinian writers such as Fadl al-Naqib, in addition to Western critics, for being too political, right, too topical. But on the other hand, Kanafani's novella Men in the Sun was critiqued by some reviewers who were invested in the Palestinian struggle for not being clear enough on its stance, right, about the question of liberation of Palestine, or, who is being faulted, who's being blamed, and what is this larger message in the end about agency, right? So that is in the novella. There were intense disputes about how to read the deaths of the characters, right? These refugees displaced during the Nakba who seek secret passage and then end up dying quietly, even desperately, in a water tank, with some saying, such an ending was tantamount to leaving the struggle on the garbage heap, right? So how do the two of you understand Kanafani's relationship to politics, even if we accept that there's, maybe the distinction itself is flawed? Like, how do you think of Kanafani's relationship to politics as far as what he's trying to say, even in ways that may not always seem as clear cut, right? Do you think it's easily mappable onto either positions we've just described, the political or not political, or do you think there's something a little more intricate going on?
So maybe just to follow the flow, I'll go next. I think I want to comment about the criticisms a bit later, especially my interpretation about the ending of Men in the Sun. But I want to talk about how I understand Kanafani's relationship to politics, and then speak to what he was producing and why, because it really relates, I think, to also the problematics of the critiques. So first and foremost, Kanafani was a revolutionary, and as Omar, you mentioned in your intro remarks, it wasn't revolutionary or writer, it was revolutionary writer. And therefore, he was deeply committed to not only national liberation, but a global revolution against Western imperialism and capitalism. And he becomes politically radicalized when he joins the Arab national movement, but transitions into developing and even more radical politics after the defeat of 1967, after the Nakba. And his politics shifts from an ethnic and nationalist perspective to a class perspective, where he becomes critical of the Palestinian bourgeois and Arab bourgeois in particular, and lets go of this idea of liberation that can be just entrusted to the Arab regimes at that time, because of what had happened in 67. So as the PFLP forms, Kennefani becomes not only the mouthpiece of the organization, but the journal of Al Hadaf. And I say this because I'm going to come back to why this is important. I think because his politics were shaped by Marxist-Leninism, in which the struggle for national liberation and social and economic rights are seen inextricably tied and linked to the capitalist system, you see this aspect of his consciousness in Men in the Sun already, by 1962, but I think further develops in his other texts. And the Palestinian refugees in that novel, when he's talking about them, he's also talking about their process of proletarianization due to the Nakba. And I think in settler colonial, studies and sort of the way Palestine gets talked about, this aspect is not really, looked upon too much in detail. And so I think what he does in that novel is speaks to their proletarianization as they become workers and as they try to stay alive through moving across different places and spaces. So I do think his politics actually maps across all his stories in all of the characters that he creates. In the novels, for example, Saad, All That's Left to You, Returning to Haifa, Kennefani brings to light the class and gender differences, oppression and exploitation through, again, these stories and characters, especially his female characters like Saad and Maryam in the story All That's Left to You. I think his novels speak especially to the social relations of colonialism, capitalism, class and race and gender. And I think Saad is of particular significance because she was a friend of Kennefani's family from Akka, and after the Nakba was living in the camps in Lebanon. And during an interview I did with Kennefani's wife, she recalls that Saad would come over to the house and give all the details of what was happening in the camps to him, and he would be writing it down and dialoguing with her. And in their exchanges, Kennefani was the uneducated in the way that he sort of self-described, of himself, and the way his wife also, kind of talked about him in that encounter. Of course, not broadly, but in that encounter. And Saad, who didn't have any formal education, actually becomes the teacher. So this whole dialectical process, really inspired the character Saad in his stories. Particularly the revolutionary mother that encourages her son to join the Fida'in. And so his relationship to politics is everywhere. It was in his workplace, it was in the writing, it was in the political organizing in the party, it was in his personal relationships, it was in the streets, it was everywhere. And not only did he write about politics regarding his own experiences and his family's experiences and the Palestinian condition more broadly, but his writing itself became a revolutionary act in and of itself because he was one of the first writers to actually write Palestine back into existence in literature, especially after the Zionist conquest of Palestine. So I think this is where, the legacy becomes important. Now, returning to the criticism, especially the critique that suggested that Men in the Sun is not clear about the stance on the liberation of Palestine. My interpretation of Kennefani's ending in Men of the Sun was actually a call for Palestinians to carve a path of existence for themselves. And what is important to remember in this book is that this book was written in 1962, well before a full established PLO, but nevertheless, Kennefani hints at the importance of an armed struggle and liberation enacted by Palestinians. And by using the metaphor and closing words in the novel, especially the words he says, why didn't you knock on the water tank? This was essentially a call for Palestinians to rise up through organized resistance. And what that looked like, I think, is up for interpretation. And I think I've been thinking about this for a really long time. So I asked his wife, in our conversation about how this got interpreted actually in that period in Lebanon and elsewhere in the Arab world. And she said that it got people really riled up, and it had actually a really big impact in political and intellectual circles, because this is also the way they interpreted it. So I think that also the notion of censorship had to be really thought about, and the conditions under which he was writing needs to be really thought about. Although Beirut was a place where censorship was, a little bit less than other countries, in order for his text to really circulate, he also had to use the craft and metaphor and imagery as a way to kind of, articulate what he wanted to say. So I think that's my criticism on that criticism. And to outline, I think, on the criticism around, not having a clear political sort of strategy, I think that to outline a political strategy in a novel is not really the place for strategy. I think it's the role of a political organization. And as we know, Kennefani was part of that and was a writer for it in terms of the journalistic aspect. And they did outline a political strategy, right? Explicitly. So I think that this is also why his novel actually remains timeless, because if he was putting in a political strategy that was relevant for that moment in that period, that potentially may not be relevant today. And so I think the novel remains timeless, actually, because there's no political strategy outlined in a clear way, but I think resistance or revolution is advocated for. And I think that those that criticized his novels for being too political, as Ismail said, the Palestinian condition is political. So, we're not even going to debate that. But ultimately, the point of culture and art is to provoke dialogue. It's to provoke thought, possibly even debate. And it's supposed to actually be open to interpretation by its audience. And how we interpret art is also deeply connected to our own positionalities, our subjectivities, and our political orientations. And so I think, I'm really curious to hear about Ismail's sort of perspective on this, because as a playwright and as somebody that is, making art, as a producer of art, how this notion of criticism can sometimes actually completely miss the point of the work that artists are actually trying to do.
Yeah, there's of course limitations in Kennefani's writing, right? As there is in any writer. I think it's also important to note that, Hassan was assassinated when he was 36. I'm 37, almost 38. So it's also, I think we have to kind of contextualize that, we're only judging a very, a quite impressive body of work for his age. But what would have been a much larger, and I'm sure even much more impressive body of work, if he were, allowed to live. One of the things I would say is, those who kind of peg Kennefani as being too political or kind of too on the nose haven't really read Kennefani close enough, right? Would argue really that there are many levels of Ghassan's work and his brilliance as a writer and as a political thinker that are not only intertwined, also not really immediately visible on a surface read, right, upon first glance. There's a lot that comes out upon first glance, I think, and that's the kind of peggable as agitprop or kind of this superficially, obviously political work. But even I admit, right, upon a first reading of some of Kennefani's work, to kind of not see a lot of the levels that he is actually excavating and laying in for us to excavate. Even returning to Haifa, which I worked on, adapting to the stage with Naomi Wallace over the course of, from writing through production for 5-6 years. Even I kind of, in the middle of a rehearsal of one of our productions or a rereading or a rewriting, have been struck numerous occasions by something I had never seen or never understood or never heard, in terms of the interactions between Saeed and Safiya, between Dove or Maryam, or Saeed and Dove. I think that there's layeredness and Hassan's craft, I think precisely because of the kind of profound intertwining of his politics and his art, kind of indistinguishable, that requires a closer reading than I think a lot of people, give credit, you know, or are able to do. I mean, I think, and also just the kind of the skill of his craft and politically, and I mean, to have, for example, in returning to Haifa, Dove, who is the son of Saeed, born to a Palestinian parent but raised as an Israeli and as a soldier, to be the person who tells the Palestinian character, so essentially an Israeli soldier telling a Palestinian man that he is weak and that he should be the one, you know, he should take up arms. There's no better reason to take up arms than to recover your son, to recover your land. It's absolutely subversive and brilliant, you know. And in my experience reading Kanafani, there's so many gems kind of hidden within the work that are comments about anti-imperialism, about identity, about exile, about home, about class, that deserve, you know, quite a lot of attention. So I think the kind of you know, paint him as too political or not political enough is kind of missing a lot of the depth that's there in his writing.
Thank you both again for two really profound and thoughtful answers. I just want to remind the listeners that we're in conversation with playwright Ismail Khalidi and scholar Chandni Desai about the work and legacy of Ghassan Kanafani. So moving on, I guess the next question I'd like to ask is kind of about, you know, how to relate to Kanafani in light of a lot of changing social and political transformations. So I'm thinking specifically of a study by Najat Rahman called In the Wake of the Poetic, which talks about how Palestinian relationships, literature have changed since the Oslo Accords, right? And as we know, right, that was sort of the moment that in many ways collapsed the liberation movement. And according to the view of this study, the decline of a robust liberation movement that had often featured literature as a vehicle of its efforts meant that Palestinian artists today are outside, right, of the oppressive political mainstream and instead located maybe in exile on the margins and increasingly focused around individual everyday perceptions of home and belonging, or, you know, so kind of a more individualized shift, I suppose, is the argument that with this loss of the liberation movement, you get an increasingly individualized relationship and idea of art. And, you know, though that study focuses on poetry, I think some of the arguments are important for thinking through the question of the official relationship between the politics of resistance and literary production and reception. So I would like to ask you on that note, what do you think is the significance of Ghassan Kanafani's legacy today, right, after all of these shifts, as we continue to struggle against and reject the geographical, political, and cultural fragmentation imposed by the Oslo Accords, possibly even to return to the consensus of being one people bound up in a protracted anti-colonial struggle?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think Kanafani's legacy will always be really significant, past, present, and in the future. But, you know, taking this post-Oslo moment that you've raised, I think you're right. You know, Oslo, especially when it comes to thinking about resistance culture, it really faded and replaced artistic focus, at least on the inside, to initiatives of peace and dialogue and individual forms of artistry. Also, the concept of resistance became a more individualized notion rather than a collective project. Whereas prior to Oslo, resistance was seen, as you mentioned, in a collective sort of sense, and art was then used as part of that collective struggle. And so I think the shift that has happened is artistic standards have started to take priority over political standards. That's, I think, how I see the kind of way in which this is happening. And not only in Palestine, but also outside within the diaspora, because also a lot of the countries that Palestinians may be refugees in or are exiled to have adopted neoliberal politics, right? And I think when neoliberalism seeps in, a lot of politics around funding of the arts is often tied to donor politics, right? And in the context of Palestine, we see that international NGOs and, you know, and aid organizations are central in that kind of thing. And so I think, so to speak to that, that's real. And I think that makes Kennefani's legacy incredibly important now more than ever, in terms of praxis, you know, for struggle today, especially his revolutionary zeal and commitment towards liberation, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, social equality, and also internationalism and global solidarity. Now, I think that for this moment, it's also really imperative for a new generation to contend with the mistakes and the failures of the past generation and really think about the future. And I think, you know, Ismail, as you brought up, returning to Haifa and the characters, Said and Safia, and that moment about, you know, what Said says at the end of the novel. I think that there's something here in that novel, especially the ending, because I think it gestures to really thinking about the past mistakes that have happened and potentially the future. So if you can recall, at the end of the novel, the main character Said says to his wife Safia, when I see Khaldun Dove, I see our mistake, our failure, our past, whereas Khalid is our future because he embodies this revolutionary zeal to fight for Palestine. I mean, in that context, by joining the armed struggle. And so when I think about that relating to the contemporary moment, and to a person that embodied this kind of politics, especially a young person, because this is the PYM, I think about the martyr Basil al-Araj in Palestine. And Basil really embodied the revolutionary spirit and commitment that Palestinians had before Oslo and before the creation of the Palestinian Authority. You know, for those of you who are not aware of Basil's sort of background, he was an activist, he was an intellectual, he read a lot. He was a political prisoner, and he criticized everything from, you know, settler colonialism to also the Palestinian Authority. And Basil spent a lot of time studying revolutionaries from Palestine, Vietnam, Algeria, South America, Europe, and began to understand various theories, political ideologies, and philosophies, including that of Marx, Gramsci, Mahdi Amel, and other Arab leftists, similar to the cadres that were historically trained in also the way that Kennefani was trained. And instead of turning the defeat of Oslo into an ideology, which I think a lot of Palestinians have adopted in the post-Oslo era, he rejected that defeat and taught, you know, sort of resistance to the university students, his friends, comrades, and try to help those around him realize resistance was possible, and also analyze the ongoing popular resistance strategies on the ground to determine whether the methodologies of their resistance was effective. And so, like Kennefani, Araj believed in both the pen and the gun, you know, and after he was assassinated also by Israel in 2017 in El Bire, outside of his house, he became a popular icon in Palestine. And you can see him graffitied next to Kennefani, for example, because he refused to adopt this defeat, to adopt defeat as an ideology, as opposed to, again, like I said, many Palestinians who have adopted or have, you know, chosen the market or consumerism or Arab idol and defeat as an ideology. So Ghassan Kanafani's legacy, I think, is about refusing the adoption of defeat as an ideology. And I think it really, if it teaches us anything, it's to make sure that we also, whether we are Palestinians, not Palestinians, internationalists in solidarity with Palestine, that we also don't adopt defeat as an ideology and pessimism as an ideology, but rather put into practice the revolutionary ideals that were around in that time of the revolution, and what that means for you know, struggle today. Of course, maybe the tactics will be different, but I think that the spirit of what was alive back then is very possible today. And you know, Ismail was talking about being in Chile, where the Mapuche are, you know, in arms, and I think that reminds us that it's happening in Palestine and everywhere around the world, and that zeal today is more alive more than ever. I mean, we saw it in the U.S. with, you know, the protests and the sort of mass mobilizations in the streets. So I think that Ghassan Kanafani is alive today more than ever, and he's not just alive in the struggle for Palestine. He's alive in so many struggles for justice, and I think that, you know, that that really gestures to the moment we're in and what is possible, I think.
I mean, I would echo that. I mean, I think, you know, Kennefani is so part and parcel of this moment of kind of connecting Palestine to other anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles, and therefore have an embedded critique of capitalism. I mean, you know, in this moment that we're in right now, we're kind of being reminded in this very brutal way of the connections between white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, and that all of these things are inextricably linked. They're symbiotic. And I think that, you know, Kennefani is, you know, represents that different moment, but one that's increasingly relevant today. And I think to read or listen to Kennefani is really to be reminded of those connections, right? As if we need reminding, but some people need reminding. And just in a way as to read Baldwin or Walter Rodney or Fanon, or Robin Kelly or June Jordan or Octavia Butler or Ursula Le Guin, and on, right? I mean, all of those people, I would put Kennefani in that category, even though he was taken from us at 36, and you know, but I think similar in some ways to someone like Baldwin, you know, he not only had that vision, but the guts to say, this is what the situation is. And there's really no other way to look at it, right? And to kind of do these kind of ethical and moral gymnastics in order to avoid the reality of injustice makes us into what Baldwin described as moral monsters, right? And I think that Kennefani had that clarity. And, you know, I would point everybody not only to his many novellas and you know, but also short stories, but also, you know, there's an interview actually in English. I think it's probably one of the few surviving interviews in which he's being interviewed in his Beirut offices by an Australian journalist. And I mean, some of his answers are just so, I mean, his English is not perfect. But you know, he says something along the lines of, you know, the history of the world is the history of the weak rising up against the strong who are exploiting them because they're weak. And of course, these are themes that show up throughout Kennefani's work. You know, he says something also, not verbatim, but, you know, in response to a question about describing it as a conflict, he says, it's not a conflict. You know, that you phrasing it as a conflict is the problem, right? And is the people, you know, because, you know, we're people fighting for our liberation, people who have been discriminated against, fighting for its rights. That's the story. There is no other story, right? And so I think that clarity, that moral clarity, is what, and that kind of internationalism and connecting those struggles is what's really needed at this moment. And I think that Kennefani really, you know, represented in so many ways. You know, I also think there's a part of Hassan's work that also captured kind of an indigeneity of Palestine, right? And I think that's also important in kind of, you know, positing ourselves as an anti-colonial indigenous resistance. You know, that I think he captured in some of the stories about the, you know, rural life and the villages of Palestine, which in itself is a kind of documentation. I mean, as Chutney described, you know, him going and kind of furiously writing notes, listening to and interviewing, you know, women from the villages and the camps. I mean, there is part of it that's kind of a creative anthropology of resistance and indigeneity that I think is a valuable tool in our toolbox, right? Of course, as Chutney says, also we have to update as artists now, especially in a post-Oslo era where there is no support from the arts, there is no real cultural resistance from the liberation movement officially, because it's become a technocratic neoliberal shadow of itself. So it's kind of ever more necessary for us to take those lessons from the past generations, learn from the mistakes, and also expand that kind of intersectionality. It's an overused word, of course, but and I think there's so many lessons to be taken from Ghassan's work and his life, and kind of updating, upgrading, and kind of intensifying our efforts at cultural resistance at a time when they're more needed than ever.
Thank you both again. I think the answers, as always, are very poignant, very brilliant, and you just kind of naturally got into the terrain of one of the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that one in the interest of time and go to the last one. But what I'll do is I just want to flag that it's really, I think, wonderful for us to be having this conversation, because both of you work in fields where it's not just about engaging Kennefani's work individually, but there's an element of interpreting, translating, through, whether it's through, the scholarly analysis or through the act of staging the play, right? And if I may, Ismail, I remember hearing you speak at UCLA several years ago, and you gave some great reflections about the impact of seeing that play staged, right, for the audience and how they resonated with it. So just the importance of, what you both are saying seems to reflect the importance not just of engaging Kennefani, of preserving him, but also making sure there's so many other avenues for others to be able to do that as well. The last question that I'll leave you with before we take a little bit from the audience is, obviously Kennefani was an accomplished creative writer, right? But he was also a brilliant and perceptive critic, right? So I'm not just thinking of the study of literature of resistance in occupied Palestine, but there's even a lot of smaller satirical pieces that he wrote over the course of his life, right? Where he critiques the work of contemporary writers. So for example, he has an untranslated review of a Syrian collection of short stories at the time written under a pen name, which he criticizes the author for leaving too little to the imagination when it comes to short stories, and at the same time, writing in too rushed of a way, right? Without having a clear, direct message in mind. And in general, he just demonstrates this clear understanding of the appropriateness of different mediums for conveying specific messages. Do either of you see a relationship between Kennefani's power as a writer and his prowess as a literary critic? Are they related, or are they incidental? And if they're connected, do you also see them kind of arching back to his larger political analysis?
Ismail, do you want to go? I can't hear you. Your mic is off.
All right, I'll go. Yeah. I think this is a great question.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm actually not well versed in Kennefani's literary criticism, so maybe Chadni, you can kind of, or Ahmad, you can speak more to kind of the details of it. But I think, one thing that immediately struck me about that question is I think in many ways, be Palestinian is to engage with and to in part be defined by fiction. By the fictitiousness and the mythologies of Zionism. I mean, we are constantly engaging by our very existence in an act of literary criticism. The lies, the stories. I mean, it's essentially a literature, both kind of produced by Hollywood, Exodus, etc., right? But also just the kind of political literature of the Zionist ideology, right? The fictions of Zionism, that at the heart of the whole enterprise. And I think so. In that sense, to be a critic of Zionism makes you a literary critic, right? Because you're not much of the time really even engaging with fact, right? We spend so much of our time literally engaging in dispelling mythologies and falsehoods and lies and creative writing, right? So, I think that there's this sense that, any Palestinian is an experienced literary critic, right? I think that goes, to engage with the mythologies of of Zionism, but any colonial or racist enterprise in self-defense is in itself a kind of an act of literary criticism, right? Because you have to constantly kind of go up against fictitiousness and create creations. So I think that's kind of like the main thing that came to mind, and I think that obviously played a role in kind of ease with which Kanafani employed his politics, to his literary criticism.
I really love what you just said, Ismail, about, the very act of the production becomes the criticism of, especially the criticism itself, but also of Zionism. And I think that what's really interesting about his process is, especially his earlier works, like I was really curious about learning about how he produced some of this. And one of the methodologies as a scholar that I use a lot is oral history, because, in the absence or captivity of Palestinian archives, you have to talk to the people. And I often wondered also what was influencing Kanafani's writing apart from the political environment, because the details are really sharp. And what I learned about him is that he would write these novellas within a day or two and no revision. So just imagine, right, what that's like. And so one thing I learned is actually he collected oral histories. So before oral history was a thing or field or methodology, he was actually collecting these oral histories, writing a lot of notes and details about people's lives, and then using that to actually defy Zionist literature that he had learned about when he was doing his study at the university. And I think that becomes really important in terms of, literary criticism as an act in and of itself. Omar, I think to your specific question around also the example you gave about his criticism of this Syrian text, I think in some ways what I was thinking about is he contradicts himself, because and I don't know, maybe he would say something very different if he was critiquing Palestinian literature from the inside or work from the inside. And why I say that he contradicts himself is because, when he talks about Palestinian resistance culture produced from within the occupied territories or within, at the time, under military rule by Mahmoud Darwish, Tawfiq Ziad, Sami al-Qasim, and the rest of the poets that were in 48, one of the things that he talks about is this idea that, daily Israeli challenges required literature to develop really quickly, which shortened the childhood phase, which the contemporary Arab literary movements had spent a lot of time debating, to the extent of what, art, how much can art be committed, and whether committed art can be creative. But for Kanafani, what he was saying is the weight of Israeli oppression itself gave a quick solution to that debate, in which Palestinian intellectuals, especially, and cultural workers didn't have the luxury to debate this. In fact, they had to write quickly, because today they could be in prison, they could be assassinated, they could be dead, and so that meant that that writing had to be done quickly. Now, that doesn't mean that the writing didn't have to have quality, but I think when you asked about that specific question, it made me think, so did he have a different idea about what it was like for other people to be producing literature, like, and by sort of ethnicity or nationality or the geographic space they were living in? And was there a particular exception around Palestine because of the condition of a Zionist occupation? So in some ways, I think that he does contradict himself as a literary critic as well, but I think that they are related. His cultural work influences both his criticism of politics and art, and I think his politics definitely influence all of his works in really critical ways.
Yeah, thank you both again. And if I may, Ismail, I think your answer makes us realize that we should all take collective pride in being actually literary critics. I think that was a great formulation. You know, we're criticizing the fiction that's been built up around us. So I'm going to go ahead now and jump to some audience questions. I'm going to go ahead and fold some together just for the sake of time, and apologies in advance, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but two that I think might be good for this particular crowd. One of them asks about Milan Kundera, this idea of finding resonance in Milan Kundera, specifically around the themes of home and exile as reflected in Kennefani's work. So I think whether or not either of you have read Milan Kundera's work, it's the question of, you know, how are home and exile, what role do they play in Kennefani's work? And can we find connections, you know, across cultures, across spaces? Or do we need to really see the idea of home and exile as being very particular to the context in which Kennefani is writing? The other one is basically when we think about the categories of iltazam and its primacy, does that kind of render Palestinian writing to be of a one-dimensional quality on some level? And does it maybe cause us to inadvertently overlook some other types of writing, right? Whether or not it's explicitly, right, falling within that category of iltazam. So I'll leave you with those two. And then after that, I think we can turn back to the organizers for concluding remarks. And feel free to answer whatever you want, just to clarify.
I'm passing the mic to you, man.
I
think, sorry, you're muted.
So I think, I mean, with Home and Exile, I think that all of his work really talks about home and exile. I think his work is trying to, you know, if what he did was to literally rewrite Palestine back into existence, he wrote about home. He wrote about the nostalgia for home. He wrote about the memory of home. He wrote about memorializing home. He wrote about the loss of home. He wrote about the journeys, right, of the Nakba that took you away from home. I mean, I forget which story this is. Land of Sad Oranges. I think this is the story where he literally, I remember when he's, you know, the story is about oranges. And at the end of the story, the orange gets wilted. And the reason the orange gets wilted is because the orange is no longer in the homeland. So he takes the orange as a metaphor of really as a symbol of Palestine that travels through Jaffa and Haifa to Ras Nakura, to the border of Beirut, then, you know, is in Beirut and then wilts. And I think this is where both the theme of home and exile are really like poignant to me, because the orange really is representative of home and what that home means in terms of Palestinian land and relationship of peasants to the land and cultivating the land, but also the exile, because when that orange is in a new geography, it wilts, you know, and it's not in the land and of the land. So I think that there's something there. I think that's the one I can think of most. It's one of my favorite stories, and I think that it speaks to a lot of the other themes, in which, if you look at a lot of the scenery, whether it's the desert and all that's left to you and the centrality of the space of the desert, or in Return to Haifa, the city of Haifa itself, or I don't know, so many stories. You really actually see place develop and place shift, and the theme of exile and home really intertwine throughout all of the narratives. And it might be really important for someone to write an essay about home and exile and how he's saying it, tracing it across all of his work. But on the other question, I'm gonna just, Ismail, do you want to jump in, or should I just go for the second question too?
Just really quickly jump in because I don't have that much.
No.
I mean, I think that the themes of home and exile are very applicable, beyond the scope of the kind of Palestinian identity and Palestinian storytelling, and the Palestinian imagination. I mean, I think, you know, you could probably read Kennefani's stories as a displaced indigenous person anywhere in the Americas, and it would have some kind of resonance. I mean, just for example. But I think also much of its resonance, of any writing's resonance about trauma, about exile, specifically about home, much of its resonance has to do with its proximity to the event temporally, right? Chronologically, right? And I think it's important to remember Kanafani's writing 19, 15, 20 years after the Nakba, right? I mean, so it's very recent. And I think, and in the midst of this burgeoning, erupting national, resistance movement and national liberation movement. So in that sense, I mean, our relationship to how we tell stories of home and exile as, in 2020, as people who are third, fourth, or three or four or five generations removed from the neck is different, right? Our proximity to that trauma is different, just as the proximity of the trauma of the Dakota people or the Mapuches is different to their kind of encounter with colonialism, or their first encounter of many ongoing encounters with colonialism. So I think that kind of how applicable it is to other situations and other experiences depends in some degree on the proximity to that initial trauma or that initial kind of exile.
Actually, can I just follow up on what Ismail was just saying? Because I think what you're saying around the translatability of his work across different contexts is so, it's not just about connection, it can translate. You can actually think that this is happening in X or Y geography, right? And I think today, as we have a global refugee crisis, I mean, it can relate to any space or place. And I think it's so true around the way in which contemporary Palestinian artists, and also especially those that are in exile, and especially the youth, are writing new narratives of exile and home. And I've been a judge on the Ghassan Kanafani scholarship both last year and this year. I don't know if that's a secret, but if it's not a secret, yes. And one of the things that when I'm reviewing the poems, I'm often really moved. Like I have to watch them. I mean, not watch them. I have to read them in parts, because the themes of home and exile and loss and trauma and intergenerational, all of this is so heavy and rooted. And they didn't experience the Nakba, but there are these new realities, right, of home and loss and what that means and identity. And I think in order to be able to fight for something, that is the first question that one has to really grapple with in terms of understanding what it is that you're fighting for. And so not just what you're fighting against, right? And Robin D.G. Kelly, since we've talked about him today, really reminds us that in Freedom Dreams, where he always says that, that we have to also know what we are for. And I think what we are for also emerges when we really understand our sense of who we are. And I think in the context of Palestine, the national identity is so important because Zionism tries to eradicate that national identity. So I think, as I'm thinking about what you were saying, I think, it's remarkable to kind of see the way a new generation is writing home and exile, and yet has these remnants and themes that are resonant with the Nakba, but are also resonant with today's realities, whether that's, economic refugees, whether it's, political persecution, whether it's people seeking asylum because of, gender based violence, or around sexual violence, or also sexual identity, right? So when we think about all of these ways in which people are claiming exile and home and the loss of that on both the intimate level, but also on the structural macro level, I think that it continues. And I think that this is where his work can be really used as an inspiration. Of course, there's things wrong with it and it's not perfect, but I think if you were to hand, I think about this a lot, that we get handed Baldwin and we get handed, June Jordan a lot, but what would it be to hand Kennefani to also the people that we're in solidarity with. I think that that needs to happen, you know, and I know that I try that, you know, here in the context of Toronto, and apart from the Zionist sort of narrative of terrorism and whatever, it's remarkable to see a new generation also start to relate to that. So I want to give an example. In a class that I teach on decolonization and resistance movements and art and the cultural production of, you know, art in this era, in the context of Toronto, we get a lot of Palestinians here that are from the Gulf. And so many of them have been, you know, their parents have sort of depoliticized them or don't want to talk about there because of whatever reasons. And the students come to know Palestine for the first time in the classroom. Of course, there's the campus politics, but in an intimate way. And when they first read Ghassan Kanafani, something happens, you know, on a psychic level. And then when they submit to me assignments, most of them start to become poetry. You know, they have this assignment at the end that has to be something as part of a cultural exhibit. And they're not artists. These are not artists. So I always find it really interesting to also give this text to younger people, especially Palestinians, but also people from other struggles, as a way for folks to really figure out who it is that they are. Because in order to participate in struggle, you need to have some form of, you know, consciousness about that. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm going on a rampage or like a tirade here, but I think there's something around the contemporary way in which home and exile are continuously being explored, thought of, and both in similar yet different ways. And I think to Omar's earlier question, we can obviously also use Ghassan Kanafani's legacy as a way to invoke and inspire that. And I know one piece I had read, you know, in a way that a poetry, one piece was so fascinating to me, because in the way that Kennefani goes on his own journey to Haifa, you know, one of the sort of artists goes on their own journey to wherever they were going, you know, in Palestine. And it's really remarkable to see how, again, it's a different reality in the contemporary, but it's so connected to the past. And so, yeah, like you just got me really thinking about this and what that means for the contemporary.
Omar, can I say just one last thing? I know we have to wrap up, but I also, and I know we didn't get to the second question really, but in terms of home and exile, I think that, you know, one thing that's really valuable to point out, as, you know, especially since in the United States, you know, Hassan is kind of, is always being doubly and triply assassinated in terms of censorship and kind of spearing him and as this and that. Is that I think that his kind of understanding of home and exile, or his explorations of it as a person, as a writer, as a political entity, allowed him to write such an amazing character in Miriam, who is the Jewish character who moves in, takes over the house of Safiya and Saeed in Haifa. And I mean, there is a relatively large chunk of the book that's devoted to her telling her story about surviving the death camps, the Nazi death camps in Europe, losing her family, being, you know, trying to find home in this land that is not hers, but she has this mythological religious connection to, but doesn't really want to be there, losing her home. You know, I mean, it's such an amazing and kind of deep portrayal, and nuanced and morally, again, there's the moral clarity of it. And I think that it's worth noting that his kind of understanding and his internalizing of these themes of home and exile, I think contributed to him being able to paint this really sophisticated, nuanced portrait of a Jewish Holocaust survivor thrust into a settler colonial situation. And mind you, in 1969, right? So I think that just came to mind as we were having that discussion.
Thank you. And thank you again for another takeaway quote of the event: assassinated 3 times, including the censorship. I think that's very brilliant.
That's so brilliant.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time at this point. So I want to thank each of you again for participating in this discussion, and I'm going to turn it back to the organizers for a wrap up.
Perfect. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Chenni, and thank you, Ismail, for your words, your thoughts and reflections, and for really speaking to the theme of our scholarship and uplifting the narratives of Palestinian resistance art and literature and dissecting it at its roots and contemporarily where it is today in the post-Oslo moment. And so thank you for that. And thank you for everyone for taking the time to listen in and spending your Thursday evening with us. Your support of the PYM and of this event means so much to us. And we hope that you all leave with the reflections and the lessons of Kennefani's work. And I will just close by saying, please check out the event chat for the links in order for you to access and purchase the anthology. Thank you so much, everyone.